Titan Talk is proudly sponsored by Barefoot. Barefoot shoes make grizzled minimalist footwear for all your athletic, outdoor, and everyday endeavors. These shoes are actually made for your feet with a super wide toe box, a flat outsole, and extreme grip pattern, giving you inhumane strength and stability when you need it for your hardest training sessions or most rigorous trails. Each shoe is made using US-sourced high-quality leather and canvas, which conforms to your feet over time, giving you added comfort with each step while protecting your feet and giving them ample freedom to function as nature intended. Listeners of Titan Talk can use code TITAN to get a free pair of awesome wraps with their shoe purchase at barefoot.store. These are a versatile wrap designed to enhance joint support in your ankle, wrist, or elbow so you can move more mass with each lift. Again, that's code TITAN for a free pair of awesome wraps at barefoot.store.
Through all corners of the universe, there echoes the heartbeat of power, a pulsing bond shared by all things. Let's embark on a journey and discover the stories entwined with strength.
Hello, my friends out there in this universe of power. Welcome to a special Space Out edition of Titan Talk. It's a Starship Spectacular. So, the only bit of strongman in today's episode is going to be a hefty congratulations to Team USA. I want to congratulate Aaron Murray, Gabby Dixon, Nadia Stowers, Inez Carrasquillo, Spencer Remick, Rob Kearney, Martins Lisis, Evan Singleton, and Kevin Ferris. Those are the athletes that made up Team USA, representing over at the Giants Live World's Strongest Nation competition. Many of them are good friends of mine, and I've had the immense pleasure of getting to know them over the years. But I do want to give a special shout out to one of the unsung heroes behind the scenes. Three of the athletes on that roster, Inez Carrasquillo, Gabby Dixon, and Aaron Murray, are all coached by Alec Jose with RPE 11 strength. And, you know, it takes a brilliant mastermind, a very versatile set of coaching skills to be able to effectively take athletes from all walks of life, wherever they may be, and shape them into the elite level strength competitor that is featured at a Giants Live show, representing Team USA at the World's Strongest Nation, and then coming up ahead. But Alec coaches three powerhouses of athletes there on that roster, but is also the coach for the reigning and newly crowned America's Strongest Man, Lucas Hatton. Now, I do want to give a special shout out to Alec because he is someone I have had the pleasure of working with before. I've done commentary with him at the Southwest Regional Qualifiers for the official Strongman Games, and he was just an absolute joy to work with. Every interaction that I've had with him has not just been pleasurable, but it's also been very insightful. And I really relish the opportunity to get to spend time and work together with him in the future. And it's just an incredible achievement for every athlete on Team USA to prove themselves as the world's strongest nation. So kudos and major cheers to the red, white, and blue out there across the pond. It's just a job damn well done, and all captained by world's strongest man, Martins Lisis. Incredible. But as I said, that is the only section of today's episode that is going to be strongman related. It is a special Space Out edition, which is meaning that we're only going to talk about space. And furthermore, we're only going to talk about Starship. This past Saturday, November 18th, 2023, will go down in history as Starship Integrated Flight Test 2. And oh my gosh, my mind is still trying to wrap itself around the events of Saturday and everything that took place. And it has had some time to kind of settle down and read and listen to all the happenings around. I'm recording this on the morning of Monday the 20th. So there's been 2 days, almost a full 48 hours since Starship took to the skies. And I can very confidently say that along with the rest of the space community, we are still in awe and shock. And I don't want to say the word disbelief, because a lot of us are very optimistic with how humanity will take these next steps forward in space exploration and innovation, and that's all spearheaded by SpaceX with this revolutionary vehicle. But before we dive too much into what happened with the integrated second test flight of Starship, let's understand the mission parameters here, because this is something that is very easily lost when the mission has already taken place and people are just focusing on what they're seeing projected on camera and news screens in front of them. So the mission parameters here for the second flight test of Starship was, of course, have a fully stacked and integrated launch vehicle. Starship, for those of you that might not be 100% familiar, is comprised of the Stage 1, the Super Heavy booster. This is a massive rocket booster that its sole purpose is to get Stage 2, Starship itself, the actual vehicle, up and out of the Earth's atmosphere. Now, the entire stacked vehicle, both comprised of the booster and the spaceship, are just about 400 feet tall. It's incredibly huge. I've stood next to this thing in person, and it is a behemoth of a vehicle. And with such an immense amount of mass, you can imagine why this booster needs to be revered as super heavy. It has 33 Raptor engines on the bottom of it. And you think to any of the launch vehicles in past history, like the shuttle, for example, or the SLS space launch system with the recent Orion spacecraft in the Artemis 1 mission, you have some solid state rocket boosters on the side, which you see those big tubes with massive engine cones at the bottom. And even on the space shuttle, you have 3 main engines that are in the backside too. So not too many engine cones coming out of those vehicles, just some really big ones. But super heavy, on the other hand, 33 of these Raptor engines on the bottom of it. It's just this massive array where you have a center portion of them, of the engines, that can actually gimbal and move around, kind of adjusting the trajectory of the vehicle as it goes up. It's just a very impressive sight to behold. So you have Stage 1, the Super Heavy booster, Stage 2, Starship itself, and technically Stage 0, which is the orbital launch mount. And that's an important one to not forget, because we'll get over it. We'll go over it again sooner. We'll go over it again soon. But that suffered some severe damage with the first integrated test flight. But mission parameters here for IFT2, Integrated Test Flight 2, or Integrated Flight Test 2. We got a lot of acronyms tossing around. Let's make sure that we're all clear on them. A successful propellant load and pressurization of the vehicle is the first box that needs to check off. This is something where if the vehicle cannot hold, I believe it's 10 million pounds of propellant and fuel, and have it pressurized adequately, how can you ask it to go up in the atmosphere where pressure changes, and let alone up into a very low pressure environment like orbit? The second level of parameter would be the flame deflector and the water deluge activation. So the flame deflector, SpaceX installed a steel disc essentially on the bottom of the orbital launch mount, whereas before it was concrete. And you can imagine that having a solid steel disc versus concrete makes it a lot more resilient, more robust, and can withstand a lot more of that immense amount of bombarding pressure coming from those 33 Raptor engines. And related to that, the water deluge system. Some people refer to it as a rocket bidet. I like to think of it as an upward-facing shower nozzle that just ejects massive amounts of water in an attempt to offset some of that raining fire coming down from those engines too. So you've got that steel disc, and you have the water deluge system spraying water upwards, and that is all just a defensive mechanism in place so that the pad does not suffer so much damage from super heavy taking off. The next level of mission parameters would be liftoff of the vehicle and clearing the pad. If the vehicle could actually achieve enough thrust, lift its mass up off the pad and begin liftoff, that's the next box checked. The next section, as the vehicle is ascending through the atmosphere, would be enduring max Q. Now, max Q is a section of the vehicle's ascent where the rocket itself is under the max amount of stress, compressive load, and just forces of strain from its ascent through the atmosphere. So that occurs at around 52 seconds after launch. So max Q, that's the next box that needs to be checked. After that, stage separation from the Super Heavy booster. This occurs at about 2 minutes and 41 seconds after the Super Heavy booster has expended the vast majority of its fuel and propellant load. There will still be a small reservoir left so that on the next phase, Super Heavy can boost back burn for a soft landing and a splashdown in the Gulf of Mexico. But that stage separation occurs at about 2 minutes and 41 seconds, whereas the Super Heavy boost back burn, after it's kind of coasted back down, nearing towards the surface, that occurs at about 6 minutes and 48 seconds after launch. We'll talk more about the stage separation shortly, but the final aspect of the mission goal for Starship would have been Starship, after stage separation, would partially orbit the Earth. I want to say around 90% of a full orbit, and perform a water landing off of the coast of Hawaii, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Now, eventually, both Starship and Super Heavy will be reusable, but on this specific mission, the final stage of the mission would have been just a splashdown of Starship. Super Heavy would have attempted a soft water landing, so it would have flipped itself and tried to slow down with that boost back burn to really mimic a sort of landing that it would experience where it were to land itself back at the orbital launch mount. Now, Starship, on the other hand, it would re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and it would essentially do a belly flop without trying to slow down one bit into the Pacific Ocean. But the main aspect of the mission parameters for Starship on IFT-2, Integrated Flight Test 2, was stage separation. That was the main goal. SpaceX clearly and explicitly outlined that before the mission ever took place. Now, there was a very, I will say revolutionary, but not because it's new, a hot staging technique. Whereas with IFT-1, the first flight test back in April 20, Stage 1 and Stage 2, the booster and the Starship, failed to separate. Because of that and what SpaceX learned, they implemented a new technique with this massive vehicle called hot staging. And they installed a hot staging ring, which is essentially a little mount about 6 feet tall that they put on top of the Super Heavy booster, and it has vents that come out the side and a little bit of a cone in the center. So what would happen is Starship, the vehicle, the ship on top of the booster, in order to separate from the booster, would activate its engines, and it would spray down that fire on top of that hot staging ring, and the vents would eject the fire outwards, and that thrust would push the vehicles apart. This coincidentally also results in about I want to say it was a 10% increase in load-bearing capacity on what Starship can take up there, because there's no really lost momentum. There's no lost inertia, or a lot less. In that moment where the two vehicles are coasting, the engines aren't completely off anymore, and all that speed that was gained in trying to get up and out of Earth's atmosphere is further held onto by Starship, the top portion of the vehicle itself, Stage 2, because the engines turn on and it doesn't lose a lot of that momentum. But this was a new technique for this vehicle. Stage separation was the goal. Anything that occurred after a successful hot staging for this launch was a total bonus. And that is something I really want to highlight, underline, bolden, italicize. That is the goal, a successful hot staging. This was outlined by SpaceX in the weeks prior to launch. So hold on to that there. Going back to Integrated Flight Test 1, back in April 20th, one of the most monumental 420s that will ever be remembered. Where did Starship fall short? Where did the whole launch process fall short? One, there was extensive damage to the orbital launch mount. This was before SpaceX installed that flame deflector plate, that solid steel pancake underneath the launch pad, and before they installed that water deluge system to spray water upwards. SpaceX knew that there was going to be some intense amount of bombardment from those engines, but they are a rapidly learning company, and they wanted to go ahead and get that launch out of the way so they could learn as much as they could, take as much data as they could, and then formulate plans for advancing the next launch, which I think things might have gotten a little further past their expectations in terms of how much damage was sustained by the orbital launch mount and the launch pad itself. Those 33 Raptor engines, when they ignited and the vehicle achieved liftoff, they blasted a crater underneath where the rocket was. And this subsequently sent sand, debris, massive concrete chunks barreling through the sky outward, to where one of the issues that happened after, and this is something I got to experience in person with that first launch, was the town of Port Isabel, which is approximately 5 miles north of Boca Chica Beach and Starbase, where the vehicles launched from, experienced a fallout of what people were very concerned with, what was the detritus that was falling from the atmosphere of the rocket launch. After the vehicle took off back on April 20th, my brother, myself, and my daughter had already gotten back in our car and were heading back home. We were passing through the town of Port Isabel, and we were at a stoplight about to head back west on Highway 100 out of there. And at that stoplight, our windshield started getting covered with a particulate matter. And I let it fall, I let it get covered, and then I activated my windshield wipers. And I realized it was sand. Sand that had been blown up from the rocket that was 5 miles away, traveled all the way over to Port Isabel, where we were waiting at that intersection to turn, and it covered our vehicle. And even after an hour of highway travel at highway speeds, when I got back to my house, our vehicle was still covered in a pretty good film of sand. And that was all kicked up from the power of the rocket 5 miles away. But there was extensive damage to the orbital launch mount, and the second aspect of this was there were multiple engine failures of Starship on ascent, of the Super Heavy booster on ascent. There are some really iconic images of just the array of circles that have been printed on mugs and shirts to commemorate the first launch, where you get to see all of the engines that were still activated, but the ones that were out. And it just looks like a very, I don't know, sort of cryptic homage to what that launch day was and what it meant for taking that next step forward and achieving a successful vehicle operation. But multiple engine failures failed or shut down. Multiple engines failed upon the ascent of the vehicle. And despite that, the vehicle still made it up all the way past max Q and to the point where the stages needed to separate. But this was the next failure of the launch. Before hot staging was implemented, the crazy amounts of pressure that the vehicle had to endure, the mechanisms that were in place to push the vehicles apart were not strong enough. You can imagine that when you have so much mass, so many million pounds of thrust sending this vehicle up to several times the speed of sound before it has to separate, there's a lot of compression on those joints, and this is all metal. So there can be expansion, contraction, adherence. Whatever mechanisms were there in place were not strong enough to push the two vehicles apart. And so we saw Starship on that first flight test begin to tumble. And when you have a 400-foot long vehicle start to tumble, it's like a skyscraper that's just falling through the atmosphere. And it was a very unforgettable sight as that thing was doing somersaults over and over and over again. And with the failure of the two stages to separate with flight test 1, the flight termination system, another acronym here, the FTS, had to be activated. But a big issue here was that there was a massive delay in the FTS activation. It should have happened a lot more quickly without so much of a delay. And it didn't. The vehicle tumbled and tumbled and tumbled for quite a long time before it finally went up in flames and bursted into a fireball over the Gulf of Mexico. But these were the 4 main areas of failure with IFT-1 that we needed to fix and address for flight test 2. So how did SpaceX address these issues in preparation for the second launch of the vehicle? Months of repairs went into re-establishing a successfully and ready launch pad for the vehicle. And again, we talked about this earlier. It included the installation of the cooled steel disc, the flame deflector plate under the launch pad itself, and the water deluge system to spray the water upwards, both factors to counteract that massive amount of output coming from those 33 Raptor engines. And on the topic of those engines, SpaceX switched from hydraulic operation of the thrust vector controls, another acronym, the TVC, to gimbal these engines around to help steer the rocket. They switched it from hydraulic to electric. And one of the big reasons they did this was so that if one engine did experience failure, the failure of this engine would not go and have a cascade effect to where it would cause the engines next to it to fail. Now, it's because they were all linked by hydraulic mechanisms before. Now, for IFT2, they were upgraded to completely electronic thrust vector controls. So this was another preventative measure so that one engine failure, if it were to happen, would not take out another one. And there were also some modifications to the engine housing of these Raptors to where they were a little bit more robust and defensive to where, let's say there was an explosion of one engine, just that impact and the localized shock would not have so much of a profound effect of the surrounding engines. You have, again, 33 of these things crammed into the bottom, the circular bottom of this rocket. They're very next door neighbors to each other, very close proximity. You want to make sure that if one does go out, it doesn't take out the others. And the next issue, the big one, the highlighted mission goal here, centered around the hot staging. And again, this is not a new concept. It was new for this particular vehicle. But hot staging was something that was used by the Titan II vehicle from NASA's Gemini program back in the 1960s, and is still currently used by Russia's Soyuz rocket. So it's not a new concept, but it is new in the terms of it has never been applied to a vehicle this size. Starship is the biggest and most powerful rocket that has ever been made. So to have these sort of new techniques, new in the sense that they've never been put on a vehicle this scale, there is a lot of uncharted waters here. And that's why this was the most important factor of IFT2. If you can't get these vehicles to separate, there's no way Starship can go into orbit. Carrying that massive booster behind it, that it's just inconceivable to try to take both those stages into orbit. You have to get that separation so that the actual ship itself can continue on its mission. And the last major improvement was a complete revamp of the flight termination system, the FTS, especially under the guidance of the FAA. If you have to self-destruct the rocket because of some sort of failure, you have a massive vehicle filled with propellant. It is a big explosion waiting to happen. You need that to effectively disintegrate itself, far away from where it can cause any harm to wildlife, to where it can cause any harm to people, to infrastructure, to other vehicles, to air traffic, whatever it may be. So the flight termination system is something that needs to be very dependable and needs to be activated very fast and very flawlessly. A lot of aspects of the newly upgraded FTS system were automated. And this is something where there are computers on board constantly performing diagnostics that if one little aspect gets too far out of a Goldilocks zone, out of an operating range, then the FTS will activate and it will destruct the vehicle before it has a chance to get any worse. Or in the case of the April 20 Flight Test 1 launch, before Starship has a chance to do so many somersaults and be barreling towards the ground. So, with all these upgrades in place, SpaceX apparently made thousands of subsequent upgrades, but these were the made ones, the ones that needed to be made before the FAA could issue a new launch license, which has to occur for any sort of launch to take place. We saw the first launch on April 20th. It was originally projected that we were going to get another launch as close as August. Now, that didn't happen. SpaceX had a lot of these measures ready to go by August, but it was looking more like late September, early October. And that didn't happen. The biggest delay was the FAA's review process in reviewing all these parameters, all the extensive damage to both the launch pad, the surrounding area. There were fires that were caused in the surrounding wildlife region. The Fish and Wildlife Service had to come out and perform a complete environmental survey. All of these aspects of governmental review from these various agencies took a very long time, and it was frustrating for a company that is constantly trying to innovate and learn from previous iterations of a vehicle, previous failures, and rapidly grow and develop and meet these aggressive timelines that both they and the government programs have set for Starship. But we finally got a launch license. I mean, and it was all very nail-biter stuff. I remember constantly checking my news feeds to see when we were going to have the FAA issue this launch license, because SpaceX had been ready for multiple weeks. Some would argue that they were ready for months. But on the week of this actual launch, I believe it was the Tuesday or Wednesday prior, where the FAA finally issued that launch license. And the license started, and it was good for November 17th through November 19th, I believe. November 17th was a Friday, and all systems looked good. I was getting ready to schedule our travel plans to go out there to watch from South Padre Island. But somewhere on that day, I believe it was on Thursday, SpaceX, Elon directly had posted a tweet to X, formerly known as Twitter, saying that the launch had been delayed from Friday to Saturday. A grid fin actuator needed to be replaced. Now, there are these grid fins that are on the Super Heavy booster that are I mean, it's exactly what the name suggests. They are fins attached to the top of the rocket where they can kind of steer. And they've got massive grids with these long fins that, as the vehicle's rapidly falling through the atmosphere, the actuators are motors that can control the tilt of these big fins and effectively steer the vehicle without having to implement any engine burn or gimbling of the engines to do so. So this is something that is completely done by fighting air resistance. And it's very useful, especially when you're talking about saving how much fuel you would have to put in this vehicle, because the more fuel that you put in there, the more weight. And this changes the whole mission itself. If you can minimize fuel usage, minimize the amount of weight you put on the vehicle, then that's more weight that you can put in Starship and take to orbit, essentially. A very useful tool to have. And this kind of gave an idea of how SpaceX wanted to go that extra mile in ensuring that they could get as much viable data as possible from this flight for future iterations of the vehicle. They were thinking ahead of that re-entry, of that boost back burn down to a possible soft water landing on the Gulf to mimic the reusable landings in the future. So they wanted to delay this launch a whole day, from the 17th of November to the 18th of November, to replace this motor that was apparently showing to be a little bit faulty or less than optimal in their initial tests. And again, we saw in many of the attempted landings of the now workhorse Falcon 9 rocket very early on that there were failures of some of its grid fins to activate effectively. And that led to many, what SpaceX calls a rapid unscheduled disassembly, or a RUD, upon landing. There was, I can't remember which launch it was exactly, but it was one of the times when a Falcon 9 was attempting to land on one of the drone ships off of the coast, and its grid fin did not activate properly. And as the vehicle landed, it landed at an angle to where the rocket, as it touched down on the drone ship, it scooted quickly across the surface of the ship and blew up on the other side. And that was just one example of many of where those grid fins are really needed to make sure that that rocket makes a very controlled and lined up descent onto its precise landing area. But again, this is SpaceX wanting to make sure that they get as much data as possible from this launch. So the really amazing thing here was that they only delayed it for a day. There is no other rocket launch company that could find an issue on their vehicle such as this and have it repaired and ready to go in 24 hours. What you saw in the coverage of Starbase on the 17th, or from Thursday going into Friday, was a destacking of Starship from Super Heavy. You saw them taking off that hot staging ring, and you saw them making the necessary changes to Starship, or to Super Heavy itself, fixing the actuator for the grid fin on the spot, restacking Starship after putting the hot staging ring on, and this was all ready to go well before that 24-hour window was met. There's no other company that can have such a quick turnaround and address that issue on site. You have it's crazy. You have the production site just a few miles away from the launch site. So that level of accessibility, that quick highway transit from one stage to the next, is just unheard of. But it is another example of how this company, how SpaceX is completely changing the way that we go about rocket launches and space exploration. And furthermore, you have just the destacking and restacking, which has over this last year become such a finely tuned skill for the company that the time it takes for them to take the vehicles down has decreased by margins every single time. I think we're looking at something about 30 minutes is what it takes now, to where it was taking upwards of an hour and a half just a few months back. And that's just incredible. Such a quick turnaround. So it kind of gives you an idea of what these launches are going to look like in the future, how fast they're going to be able to happen. So then we get to November 18th, the actual launch itself. And I wanted, this has just been a big goal of mine, not just as a space enthusiast, but as a parent now. I wanted to take my daughter Xiomara to go see the launch. I took her to go see IFT-1 back in April, but she is about 20, going on 21 months old now. So at the time, she was much younger. She was just a year and 2 months old back in April. While she enjoyed herself and being around a crowd of people for that April 20th first launch, now she has a lot more of an idea and understanding of her place in the universe. She is extremely fascinated with the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, and rockets. She knows what they are. We read books about them, and she can say all of them. I ask her, Zio, what sound does a rocket make? And she goes, and she says, up, up, up. And I ask her, where's the rocket going? Bye-bye, Earth, is what she says. So she knows what these things are, and kind of having that level of established awareness of oneself in the universe and where humanity currently is with space exploration at such a young age. She's not even 2 yet. I want to kindle that curiosity, and I want to nourish it, and I want to grow it as best I can. And, getting out there for flight test 2, I had to be up by 3:30 in the morning. As hard as that is, there was no way in hell I was going to miss that. There was no way I could miss the opportunity to take her out there to see this rocket launch. So 3:30 a.m. wake up time. I'm getting ready. I'm getting breakfast set, getting her whole diaper bag set, my hiking backpack for her, just making sure we have everything that we need. I wake her up from her slumber, and she normally wakes up around 8 a.m., but she was up at 4 a.m. this time, and we hit the road. As we're driving the hour and 15 minutes from where I live in Edinburgh, Texas, out to the coast, out to South Padre, the conditions are very foggy. This is a seasonal time of year where it still gets hot during the day, between 80, 85 degrees. But as the night cools down, a lot of that moisture, a lot of the subtropical humidity that we have here, which is often above 70%, close to 90, nearly 100% humidity, it condensates and settles down to the ground. So as we're driving out to the beach, it's very foggy inland conditions. And this is making me a little bit concerned. Like, are we going to be able to see when we get there? Are we going to be able to have a good view of the rocket as it takes off? With Flight Test 1, we watched from Port Isabel. So we were just about a mile or so inland. And I do remember even on April 20th, there was a lot of haze, a lot of humidity in the atmosphere, to where we got to see Starship leave the launch pad, and we got to see it ascend through the initial phase of its liftoff. But once it got about 1,200 feet up in the air, we lost it due to cloud cover because there was still just so much humidity and haze. But I was hopeful that with our plans of watching from the coastal side this time, from South Padre Island, just a little bit further northward, but looking straight down the coast, when you're there on the ocean side, a lot of that humidity and that moisture is completely offset by the fact that you're right there along the ocean. So yeah, if you're inland a mile or so, you're going to have a lot of fog. But being there on the coast, at least the plan was that there was not going to be any fog. And of course, that can be not the case sometimes. There is such a thing as foggy mornings beachside too. But I was hopeful, and the fog was dense, and it was thick, even all the way up to Port Isabel. We arrived on South Padre Island at 5:45 a.m. We crossed the Queen Isabel Causeway, and lo and behold, as soon as we got there, it was clear skies. It's still very dark, still before sunrise. Sunrise is about 6:30, 6:40 in the morning these days. And we parked at a friend's condos, which was a little bit northward of the planned viewing area near Isla Blanca Park at the very southern tip of South Padre Island. And after getting my daughter set in her hiking backpack, we walked along the beach. And I didn't know how long of a walk it was. I knew from just the distance that I drove and looking down the beach. So I'm like, okay, it's a long walk, but I've got 30 minutes until lunchtime. A little bit more than 30 minutes, about 45 minutes. I can do it. I can sprint walk. And I did. It turned out being a 2.2 mile sprint walk along the beach down from where we parked all the way to Isla Blanca Park. Now, normally a 2.2 mile sprint walk is something of a bit of an activity and performance endeavor, especially with Zio on the hiking backpack being carried by me. But this was before sunrise. You start getting that glow of the sky changing colors out towards the east. And you've got the seagulls running along the beach shore. You've got pelicans flying overhead. The world is starting to come alive around you, and the sun is starting to break just above the horizon. You just see that orange filament glow as it starts to rise. And you have, as we get closer towards Isla Blanca Park, you have more beachgoers starting to increase in density and number, all heading to the same direction. Just the atmosphere was such a vibe. It was total perfection, and it felt so special. I really can't describe the feeling of like all of us humans walking along the beach as the sun was rising over the perfect horizon on the ocean. Birds around us, like it was incredible. It felt so special. We arrived at Isla Blanca after the 2.2 mile walk with about T-minus 2 minutes on the clock. 2 minutes till launch. We see everyone gathered around their viewing areas. Some people are up in the dunes, but I pick a spot, and Zio and I have a straight view down the remaining coastline to where we see Starship right there on the orbital launch mount. You've got the strobe lights flashing. The sun is already above the ocean, and it's just painting the whole image in just the most beautiful lighting possible. T-minus 2 minutes. The clock keeps ticking down. I'm watching the live stream on my phone. I've got my camera recording. Zio's looking at it. She sees the rocket, and there's just this suspense from all the beachgoers around us, the crowds of people watching at the same time too. There's even a hold for a brief second by the launch command, where they hold at 40 seconds on the clock for a bit, and then the countdown starts again. So here we are, right when the launch window opens at 7 a.m. It's about 7:02, and it gets to countdown, 10 seconds. And you can just feel it in the air. Everything's standing still. All of a sudden, and well before the live stream actually catches it, because there is a bit of a delay, I see it. I see the glow. I see the smoke start billowing out, and it just lights up this area that opposite from the sun out to the east, this area that is still the darkest blues, is glowing with orange fire. And it happens. The candle is lit. Starship begins to ascend from the launch pad, and we see it, those 5 miles between us, we see it so much earlier than we start to hear it. The vehicle very clearly rises up beyond the pad before we start getting bombarded with the booms of all of those 33 Raptor engines, making this 400-foot structure soar up into the air past its launch mount. And I tell you what, it was very clearly observed that the everything that was coming up from the rocket was much cleaner than last time. There was not so much sand, not so much debris. We had a very clear view of the rocket. But that sound, there is, you can hear some of these sounds through a lot of the videos, but the noise output is so loud for all of the microphones on any of the recording devices that we have. that it is no comparison to even standing 5 miles away. You feel every bone in your body begin to rattle by just the booms of these engines. Your body is vibrating from the sound. It is loud, and it's not ear-shattering loud. I mean, you're not in pain from how much sound it is, but it is loud, and you are feeling these massive vibrations from head to toe, and you're watching this vehicle as it ascends. The burn was so clean. It was so clean. Every single one of those 33 engines stayed burning for the entirety of stage 1. And even from the 5 miles away, the best way I can put it, these methane-fueled engines produced a bluish silver star glow coming from the bottom of the rocket. It's not your typical orange, yellow, and red fire. It was like you're watching a pale white dwarf star in the distance, but 33 of them just glowing as bright as could be from the bottom of this. And the burn was so clean. The burn was so clean. The sound was so immense, so powerful with its resonance. The debris plume seemed totally mitigated from before in comparison to Flight Test 1. And the view from the coast, I would do it over and over and over again. As soon as the vehicle clears the launch pad, you start seeing how those engines are gimbling to start steering the vehicle up and over the Gulf. And we have a perfect trajectory view of how it starts to go up and over. The rapid acceleration and ascension of the vehicle to the limits of our view happened so quickly. And that's one thing that I still struggle to wrap my mind around, is you see from the third-person perspectives, from a lot of the highlight videos, the videos that get published on the news to SpaceX's feed, you have those up-close drone shots, or you have the aircraft shots following this thing as it goes through the upper levels of the atmosphere, or the targeting cameras with just the incredible zoom. But when you see it from your perspective in person, and you see how quickly such a massive rocket can lift off and accelerate, it disappears from view so fast. Even being 5 miles away, I am looking up just like at the end range limit of my neck's extension, because that's how high it's gotten already. And I tell you what, my daughter's reactions the whole time from the backpack, I can hear her behind me, and she's just like, wow, up, and she is just completely in amazement. And I can just feel her, like she's kicking, and she's completely reacting to this spectacle in front of her in the best way. And it just warms my heart and fills me with joy. And I would do it over and over and over again, specifically for her ability to see it and react to it. One of the picture perfect things here, like everything went so right. Everything went so right from the launch window. All boxes checked, pressurization, and then the sunrise. The sunrise with the sun just being barely above the surface of the ocean painted the entire picture in such a unique way. You have the pinks, the oranges, the reds, the purples, the blues. Starship on the side of it is getting that freshly painted orange from the sun, and on the other side of it is still dark. It was just perfect. It was absolutely perfect. Could not have asked for a better setting for this monumental day. Stage separation, the moment we were all waiting for. After almost the complete fuel expenditure of Super Heavy, we're watching, and you see, of course, you see the first plume when the vehicle goes hypersonic, when it starts going faster than the speed of sound. It starts having a different level of exhaust, and that gets painted by the sun in a certain way. But then you're waiting for that second plume. The plume of the engines when all 33 of the Raptor engines on Super Heavy shut off, and then the engines on Starship are activated. And we see it. We can see it plain as day from where we are. The engines, the fire, the vehicles separate. You can see Super Heavy booster start tilting off in the distance, and Starship, lit by its Raptor engines on its bottom side, glowing like another blue star, a tiny little speck of blue light taking off towards space. It occurred. It was successful. About 20 seconds or so after stage separation, as Super Heavy is beginning its flip maneuver, preparing itself for its reentry and its inevitable boost back burn. You can see some of the I guess, what are we going to call them? Little tiny boosters that are meant to steer the vehicle from the top to where it's trying to flip the vehicle back into the right position. You see them going off. And then the engines try to reignite, and Super Heavy experiences a rapid and scheduled disassembly. And that's the flight termination systems realizing that something is off. Something is off, and it's not able to control the vehicle, but it happens instantaneously, and the vehicle so perfectly disintegrates. It's just an incredible boom and a plume of explosion. And we can even see that after the explosion occurs, the tiny little specks of just twinkling debris, the tiny, such a massive vehicle that we can still plainly see, no matter the fact that it's, I believe, 24 miles up, it gets disintegrated into the smallest little pieces. A very effective operation of the flight termination system for stage 1. But there it is. Regardless of what's happened to the booster, Starship continues on its way. It cruises upward to space, and it makes it to space. And it disappears from view as a small little twinkle in the sky. But Starship, for the first time ever, made it to space. And there on the beach, and there's one point where I just throw my hands upward and scream up, yeah, to the sky. And my daughter screams too, and you have the entire crowd of all the beachgoers just cheering and applauding. You have people from all walks of life, from all corners, speaking all different languages, not just English and Spanish, but German, Mandarin. You have languages that I am so unfamiliar with that I can't discern what they are. Old, young, you've got dogs out there. It's just an incredible environment to be in, where you have people coming together, realizing that they are a part of something bigger than themselves on that day, that you are witnessing the future. No matter what happens to this vehicle, that hot staging occurred, no matter the fact that the booster had to blow up, or no matter the fact that Starship inevitably itself also had to be activated its flight termination system. It was a total success, and we witnessed that next breakthrough step for humanity in its conquest to explore the moon, Mars, and beyond. It was a long walk back, and again, at the time, I did not know that we had walked 2.25 miles. I didn't know that until I traced it out on my phone, on my Google Maps, to see how far we went. But I'm turning around, and I can't even see the condos that we parked at. So I'm like, all right, we do have a long walk back, but there are people walking around us, also walking back to wherever they parked. And I just have the biggest smile from ear to ear, and Zio does too. I can see her on the camera that I have facing backwards, that she is just so elated with the whole experience. And it was a very pleasant and happy walk back. Even the drive home, the whole hour-and-a-half drive home, I recall myself being constantly overcome and repeatedly overcome with emotion. There were moments where I just felt my eyes start to water up, and it sounds so cheesy. I know I romanticize everything, right? Like, not everyone's as nerdy or geeky as me, but there were moments where my eyes would tear up because I just felt so empowered by the fact that we were a part of this event that was much larger than each of us, that we witnessed history. And it made me filled with joy. It made me so proud to be a human. It made me so proud to be a father and to share that with my daughter. And it made me so excited for the future. But after that 4 a.m. wake-up time, you can imagine that little Zio, less than 2 years old, as soon as we got in that car and started driving, poor baby knocked right out. And she took a very, very long nap for the drive and probably dreamt about space and rocket launches the whole way home. So let's talk about the big wins for SpaceX. Let's start from the ground up. The pad looks absolutely incredible. It looked incredible the day of, and now even 2 days later, seeing all of the pictures coming out of what the pad looks like, it's in pristine shape. It's in pristine shape. There's no crater. There's no chunks of anything missing. It looks exactly as it did from my perspective. It looks exactly as it did prior to the rocket and the vehicle being stacked on top of it. And to further that initial interpretation of the pad's condition, Cameron County reopened the roads going through Starbase and to Boca Chica Beach very quickly, in under 2 hours. The beach and the access roads had to be closed for days after the first Starship launch due to debris, due to concrete chunks and craters and things like that everywhere. But in under 2 hours, the county came out, assessed everything, and realized it was perfectly fine and opened the roads to public access. You could go on the beach in Boca Chica right there, right outside of Starbase in under 2 hours after the launch. That's incredible. So the condition of this pad and the orbital launch mount is going to really allow for a rapid launch cadence in the coming weeks and months. It's just, I am so taken aback with the immense power of the vehicle and the effectiveness of the flame deflector and the water deluge system. That just incredibly job well done, SpaceX. These were things that on paper they looked like they were going to work well, but you never know how it's going to do in that moment. But it's just pristine. It looks great. The next win, 33 Raptors. Every single engine on stage 1 stayed lit for the duration of its ascent burn. And these vehicles undergo a series of static fire tests where they're restricted to the orbital launch mount and the engines are turned on for an extended time, but not a very long time in comparison to the full liftoff itself. And with IFT-1, back on April 20th, many of those engines experienced a failure and went out. But all 3 engines stayed lit. This proves and secures Raptor as a viable engine in this specific configuration for the vehicle. There's no doubt anymore, is it going to work? It worked. Maximum thrust, maximum reliability, maximum output. And having all 33 of those engines lit made for some incredible views. Like I recounted earlier, it looked like a star glow, a blue star glow going up. But there are some of my favorite views and pictures captured from this launch are not of the vehicle as a whole. Like there are some really cool pictures that have been released, especially of stage separation. But my favorite pictures so far have been just of the bottom portion of the vehicle as it's leaving the launch pad. All 33 of those engines being lit successfully creates this phenomenon called a Mach diamond, where as the rocket ascends, as those plumes of flames are coming out, it creates this optic of these perfect rhomboidal diamonds under the rocket in its actual flame outputs. That just it's absolutely beautiful to see these geometric patterns form themselves in fire. But yeah, so all 33 of them, just incredible. The thrust vector controls, the engine gimbaling, the ability to steer those engines was nominal, and the vehicle was in total control of its trajectory the entire time. Another big win. Once again, Starship shrugged off the moment of max Q, the highest vehicular load and stress on the vehicle, like it was nothing. For a 400-foot tall structure to do that, for essentially a skyscraper to be able to do that while in motion, while accelerating through the atmosphere at multiple times the speed of sound, it's huge. It's huge. And the biggest one of all, hot staging. This was it. This was the goal. Both portions of the vehicle separated, regardless of the fact that Super Heavy had to be detonated about 20, 30 seconds later. This was the goal, and people need to remember that for everything that is going to be said about this launch in the coming weeks and months. Hot staging worked, and it will result in a 10% more load being able to be carried into orbit, and that's huge. That's huge when we think about how we're going to get to the moon, what we're going to put on the moon, and how we're going to get to Mars. So it worked, and there will be a lot of data taken away from every single millisecond of hot staging and how they can improve even further the condition of both Starship and Super Heavy post-stage separation. Another big, and everything after this point, again, this was a bonus. This was bonus territory. Starship made it to space for the first time in history. Starship itself made it above the Earth, past the Kármán line, and into space. The flight termination system worked incredibly well on both stages. Some would argue it perhaps worked too well. I mean, these were automated systems now, to where if the computers on board realized a problem, they would terminate and destruct the vehicle very quickly, and possibly too quickly to a point where the vehicle wouldn't get a chance to really try to correct itself. But this was something that the FAA was going to be watching with very, very close eyes, especially after the mishaps of the first flight test, where there was too much of a delay in FTS. The flight termination system worked flawlessly on both stages. Super Heavy disintegrated and almost looked like it dissolved, and Starship, when it lost its signal and eventually had to have its FTS activated somewhere over the course the Caribbean, that worked incredibly well also. So these are things that are going to satisfy a lot of the demands of the FAA and hopefully result in a much shorter and significantly shorter certification time for a new launch license. So with all those big wins, the next major objectives for the upcoming test flights, the first one is going to be a need for successful flip maneuvers and boost back burns of the Super Heavy rocket and booster so that it can progress closer to a full reusability and land eventually on Mechzilla, the orbital launch mount with those big chopstick arms. That's the plan. The plan is for Starship to launch up, Stage 1 to separate, and for Super Heavy, Stage 1 to boost back burn itself and land perfectly right back on the orbital launch mount, being caught by Mechzilla. We want to see that soft splashdown in the Gulf. And of course, SpaceX is going to do that soft splashdown first. They have to show that the vehicle can slow itself, can position itself straight, and pinpoint land where it needs to. There's no messing up when it comes down to actually putting that thing back on the orbital launch mount. And I do suspect that at some point, SpaceX will install some legs on the bottom of the Super Heavy booster. And kind of like as a redundancy, as a fallback. If, for whatever reason, the Super Heavy booster cannot slow down enough or comes down too hard and to where it busts those chopsticks that are supposed to catch it on Mechzilla, there's no fallback to where it's just going to crash down. And as powerful as those 33 engines were with the first flight test and what they did to the launch pad, Super Heavy crashing down and then erupting into a fireball would be a very different outcome in terms of damage to the launch mount. So I do suspect at some point we're going to see some legs of some sort fabricated and implemented to Super Heavy's design. But that's way in the future. Although SpaceX is an expert now at landing Stage 1s with Falcon 9, Super Heavy is a behemoth vehicle in comparison, and it's a totally different ballgame of physics. So we really do need to see this boost back burn and this soft landing to show that they can put it back on the orbital launch mount. Think of the force loads and the remaining fuels and how their volatile states can affect engine reignition here. That might have been some of the problem with why Super Heavy experienced that RUD right after stage separation. This ability to re-land Super Heavy is going to be entirely dependent on the data evaluation on stage separation and what effects it had on Super Heavy as it separated from Starship. And this data evaluation phase is, you can imagine that SpaceX got started on it as soon as the launch was over. So the next major hurdle and the next major objective is the continued engine burn of Starship, of Stage 2, until it gets to its coasting phase in orbit and its eventual splashdown off of the Pacific, or off of the coast of Hawaii in the Pacific. I don't know if for Flight Test 3 there's going to be any changes with the final phase of the mission in terms of what Starship does when it re-enters, where it lands. But the rapid unscheduled disassembly of Starship with the FTS activation happened right before the secondary engine cutoff of the vehicle. So we want to see the full engine burn. We want to see that orbital coast phase, and we want to see that reentry. The vehicle also needs, and the vehicle being Starship itself, stage 2, it also needs to be able to prove to be able to fully land. Now, this is something that it needs to do in the lower gravity environments like the moon and like Mars, but it is something also that it should ideally need to be able to do on Earth. And this is not new. Back in 2021, ship number 15, SN15, did this, where it did its high altitude test and it came down and it landed. So SpaceX is relatively confident that they can get Starship to land itself. But again, it is a very different ball game when it has to do it after all of the other recent mission parameters have been done, after the launch, after stage separation, after the orbit burn, all of that stuff. The final big milestone, and I say final as we're thinking towards the big objective, landing on the moon, Artemis 3, somewhere in 2025, 2026 is the projected time frame. Very aggressive, but that's the projected time frame that SpaceX is contracted under NASA to be the lunar lander with Starship. The next massive milestone, the penultimate milestone leading towards lunar landing, is going to be showing that you can refuel Starship in orbit. A transfer of propellant loads in a Earth gravitational environment is very different than a transfer in orbit in 0 Gs when you're moving around the Earth at about 17,000 miles per hour. So there will be some point in the future where we're going to see an iteration of Starship that's going to be essentially a tanker, where you are going to fill up this vehicle with a massive amount of fuel, put it on top of a super heavy, throw it up into space, and have it serving as a fuel depot in orbit. And then there's going to be a subsequent actual Starship vehicle that will mimic the lunar lander version of it, that will attempt to refuel in orbit, because the fuel that Starship will use to get to orbit is going to be expended, and there's not going to be enough reserves left to get it to the moon and beyond. That's why you do need to refuel in orbit, and we've covered this before on previous space outs. So with those milestones in kind of the objective view and focus, when will the next launch be? Multiple vehicles are already fully constructed and awaiting deployment in the massive bays at Starbase. They only need minor modifications prior to any sort of launch. And we've already seen, I believe, Booster 10 or 11 rolled out from the Massey's test site back to the production bays at Starbase. They're already, and this happened last night. I'm seeing coverage of that booster being rolled on those modular transport vehicles back to the high bays. So the company is already at work retrofitting and making the adjustments needed for these vehicles to be ready and prepared for the next launches. And the thing is, as you get down the line of the serial numbers of these vehicles, each vehicle is a newer version of the previous. Each vehicle is better. And every iteration of the vehicle that has happened since these last two that went up in flight test 2, they're improved, they're more advanced, they're more modified. With the pad so intact, SpaceX is ready to push for a very aggressive trial cadence. The limiting factor is not going to be the preparedness from the company's standpoint. It's going to be, once again, government speed. The FAA will have to review all of the flight data. Because there were two RUDs, rapid and scheduled disassemblies, and the FTS was activated on both stage 1 and stage 2, that is textbook of the FAA needing to conduct a mishap investigation. If an FTS is activated, the FAA, by its responsibility and role, has to conduct a mishap investigation. But we can only be optimistic that with the successes of how quickly and efficiently FTS was activated, and with the Senate hearings of the private space community, with SpaceX spokespersons going out there and imploring the government to double resources at the FAA to hasten the launch license certification process, keeping in mind that we are trying to compete with China in getting to the moon first, we can hope that there's going to be a faster turnover. And also with keeping in mind how well condition the paths left in, I suspect that there's not going to be so much environmental concern. There were no fires. There was no debris fallout. This was something that I think that SpaceX proved that, okay, we took all of these issues from the first flight test and we made the modifications needed to mitigate them on the subsequent ones. So, excitement ahead in that realm at least, and we can't do anything but be optimistic. But, the media. To no one's surprise, the media instantly took to the streams and touted IFT-2 as another failure for SpaceX. You're seeing headlines immediately as soon as the rocket launches. SpaceX fails a second time. Both parts of the rocket explode, so-and-so. Anyone who paid attention to the mission goals prior to launch knew that stage separation was the absolute main objective. This is the reason why that there are no government entities that would be able to innovate and successfully make a revolutionary vehicle such as Starship. Is the second that that a launch goes by and that there's any sort of explosion or any sort of quote-unquote mishap, no matter how minor, the media would completely latch onto it, skew it out of proportion, and politicians would be all over the agency to shut it down. That's why NASA goes through years and years and years of computer simulations, trial before actually sending the rocket up and into space. So you have some of the NASA diehards, the ones who are so quick to just repel anyone who is a SpaceX dog, as I've seen them referred to. They're like, well, Artemis on its first try went to the moon and back, and SpaceX has already failed twice in getting its vehicle to orbit the Earth. Yeah, SpaceX is a brand new vehicle, a brand new configuration. It is the most powerful and largest rocket ever built, and it's also happening on a very aggressive time frame. The Artemis 1 mission, the construction of the Space Launch System and the Orion spacecraft, took years upon years upon years before it finally went up. So yeah, NASA had the time to run every possible simulation it could to ensure that their massively and insanely expensive vehicle, too expensive, did not blow up. And of course, NASA pulled it off. But when you have this rapid innovation, when you have a new vehicle, and when you have a company, a private firm, that its core, method is test, innovate, and retest, no matter if you have to expend the vehicles, that's where you're going to see the rapid innovation. That's where you're going to have the privatization of space paving the way for the innovation and the next steps of humankind taking to the cosmos, to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. I saw it put this way. If you're a fan of SpaceX, Flight Test 2 was a total success. If you're spoon-fed by the media, Flight 2 was a failure. You have to be very weary about what you're reading because, if you are paying attention to these stories as they're developing through the years and the months prior, then you know that this was an overwhelming success, and you can understand why we are still wrapping our mind around just the total success of Saturday's launch. But if you're spoon-fed by the media, you're going to be a total critic, and you're going to want to shut SpaceX down because in your mind, they've failed twice. When in reality, it is an overwhelming, massive leap forward. And Flight Test 3, just like Flight Test 2, is going to be another exponential increase in success rate. So, Starship is on track. Starship is on track. Artemis 3 and the aggressive timelines to put humans back on the moon is not out of the picture. But what we do need is we need to have the government on board with making sure that the certification process for these launch licenses can keep up with making sure that China is not allowed to set foot on the moon first. I'm damn excited for this next chapter of humanity as it continues to unfold. I am so excited. We are living in the most exciting time for our species as a whole to be taken to the cosmos and beyond. So, to you all my friends, wayfaring this universe of power, I end today with a poem by Dylan Thomas. I feel it captures the essence of these incredible events that have unfolded, and it's just the most appropriate way I can end today's episode. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learn, too late, they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay, rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. This has been Titan Talk. Until next time.